here, and I want to make sure that I am clear on all of it. So if something's not clear along the way, I will keep an eye, hopefully on chat, or somebody can flag me, and I'll try to also address clarity as I go. This is ORVI's latest report, and we've done a series of reports. The last one at the end of last year actually looked at the jobs data and the income data and the economic indicators, and really found that there was not a long-term lasting economic impact of this facility, which I don't think is terribly surprising. Zooming out for a little bit, most of my research across the country and across our region focuses on tax incentives. And tax incentives, I will just kind of hit the basics real fast, are basically anything that the government gives away to a business to try to promote that business coming in and growing the economy, right? Whatever that means. There's a lot of different ways to define growing the economy. Industry loves when we define growing the economy by gross domestic product, GDP, because that's the value of their product. And so it can look really good, especially in the petrochemical industry, where the value of your end product can be quite high, right? Think about natural gas. That's a really high GDP commodity. The problem is that when you look at economic development outcomes in terms of jobs or income for local residents, usually that's not all of GDP. Usually the folks who actually work and employed do not get most of the benefits of the production. A lot of it is siphoned off to headquarters and other capital projects and salaries out of state and out of region. And so that's basically what I study, is these approaches to economic development that have generally not worked very well. They've kind of tended for the last 40 years to overpromise and underdeliver on actual results. So why do we keep doing it? And the answer to that is really that we are locked in a constant state of competition that between states and between counties and between regions that really probably doesn't need to happen. But this really gets at the core of this report, which examines the tax incentives and the return on investment or lack of return on investment of the Shell facility in Beaver. And so the report is titled Pennsylvania's Bad Bet, because really Pennsylvania unleashed a lot of money that could have potentially been diverted to other programs, other higher evidence-based ways to develop a regional economy than giving it all to Shell. Just a disclosure, I live in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm a PhD candidate at Ohio State, wrapping up my dissertation on all this stuff. And we have Intel. If you've seen the news, Intel is supposed to come to Ohio. They just announced a delay. Just to give you kind of an idea of, Intel is a $7 billion tax incentive project when you add up all the county, township, city, and state and federal tax incentives. Intel's building a $20 billion facility and getting about a $7 billion tax benefit from it. And usually when I start presentations like this one about Intel, I say, if I gave you $7 billion to make Ohio a more attractive state for people to move to and work in and raise families in, how would you spend it? And I have never once had an audience member say, I would give the $7 billion to a single company. It's just not a very smart idea, right? And so that's really what the core of this report looks at with Shell, which is, if Pennsylvania wanted to economically develop a region, giving a huge windfall to a single firm is usually not the most diverse way and best way to do it. And I'll talk about all of that. So this goes really back to 2012. Many of you are probably familiar, and some of you more familiar than I am even, with the intricacies of this history because you lived it. But the Keystone Opportunity Zone program was this tax incentive program, is this tax incentive program in Pennsylvania. And it underwent an expansion in the beginning of the last decade in the State House. And I think, I won't make this claim factually, but I think that the two things are very close together, in that this extension really paved the way for Shell and may have been partially motivated to try to win this Shell project from nearby states. So two things happen in that expansion. As one, you get exempted from even more local taxes. And two, the feedstock tax credit, which subsidized at the time about 14% of the raw ethane cost at 5 cents per gallon. And if you add these up over the 40 years that this original economic study projected, that's billions of taxpayer dollars or revenue that could have been collected. You hear criticism a lot. People say, well, but if Shell hadn't built anything on the land, then we wouldn't have collected revenue anyway. And that is probably partially true, but it is certainly true that taxpayer dollars are diverted to this project in the form of this tax credit on feedstock for other companies as well. So one of the things that we really hammer in our report is if you go back and read, and again, all of you probably lived this to some degree, if you read media from the time of the Shell announcement back in 2013, 2014, 2015 period, what you really see is you see this Robert Morris University study cited everywhere. Everybody is saying, oh, it's going to create 450 jobs, which is magically the exact number you need to qualify for the Keystone credit. Oh, it's going to create, thousands of construction jobs. It's going to create all this long-lasting economic value for Beaver County and for the region. And so we actually said, well, let's look at that study more critically. Let's actually, apply our expertise and go through their modeling assumptions and see how they got these numbers that our previous reports kind of show not quite true, right? They kind of overpromised and underdelivered. And so I'm going to just walk through some of the core flaws with that original study. And this is a very common type of study used across all types of industries around the country. Typically, when industries are fishing for tax incentive deals and packages from states, they put together a quote unquote independent analysis. They hire somebody to do it for them. And those folks typically use what's called input-output modeling. Input-output modeling, incidentally, actually has its kind of historical basis in kind of a Soviet-style economy where you needed to see how all the pieces connected. And if you pull the lever, if you're a central planner, a centralized person who controls the entire economy, right? If you pull the lever that says, I want more workers making, producing wheat, you have to know what industries you're going to then have a domino effect on, right? You're going to have more folks who need to be in the mills, and you're going to have more folks who need to sell flour and, finished refined wheat products. So you have to see those connections. It can be valuable for that. What input-output modeling is not good at is forecasting. It is not a good tool for predicting the future. It is a model that essentially doesn't actually include prices. It's a commercial model. Implan is a name you might have heard. They're a company that runs this model. RIMS is another version of this model from the federal government. But essentially, the Implan model in particular is really expensive to use. That is what the Robert Morris folks used, to our knowledge. And Implan, interestingly, does not include any prices. So I'm an economist, and I will tell you we live in a world with prices. And when you start having a large company come in and, oh, we're creating 9,000 construction jobs in the county, those jobs have to come from somewhere. There have to be people who work those jobs. And if you need to hire that many construction workers on short notice, you're probably going to have to pay them pretty decently to lure them away from other jobs. And if you do that, the wages, the price of labor goes up. You might need additional land. You might need transportation. You probably need cement and construction material and metal. And all of those inputs to building your plant are going to affect the price across the board of construction materials, of labor, of work, of hiring workers. And that has a cascading ripple effect on the rest of the community, right? Here in Columbus, there's been all kinds of articles that have run with intel about farmers in the eastern part of the state trying to buy farmland. They can't, because the speculative price of that land is bid up by tech speculators trying to think that land will be worth something when intel is built. Similarly here, you start having prices that start changing. And other businesses in the region have to respond to those changes. If the cost per hour of a construction worker goes up, that could be great for the worker, but it might make another business in your county say, well, I'm going to delay my plans to build a new warehouse and hire some employees because I can't afford to build it right now because Shell is building this thing and they're sucking up all the workers, and Shell is subsidized. Shell has billions of dollars it's getting on the back end from the state. I can't compete with that. I'm not subsidized by the state of Pennsylvania. And so this model doesn't really capture those price effects. It doesn't capture a market effect. which is always kind of comical to me because I think that they portray it often as, oh, this is just the free market. But there's really nothing free market about it when your model doesn't include prices and you are getting a massive kind of subsidy from the government to do the project in the first place, and other companies you're competing with aren't. Uh, Two, the model that they used didn't consider the tax incentives at all. So there was no discussion in their report about the tax incentives and whether that the projected return on investment would exceed the cost to the taxpayers in terms of foregone revenue. There was no attempt to try to quantify how much of this activity would be net new versus how much of it might have happened anyway, in terms of, the construction workers who built the Shell thing might have built another facility in the same period, in another part of the county or region. And so you're not really employing anybody new. You're just shifting them around to employ them for Shell versus another project. And so there's not really an attempt to try to quantify that. And then most importantly, there was no attempt to include what we the jargon we would use is non-market costs. So whenever anything like this gets built, if you live near it, your home value is not going to be the same after it's built, right? That's kind of common sense. It's probably difficult to sell your home for the value that you want for it once a large plastic facility has been in the news for flaring and polluting the environment and exceeding its emissions values. And that's a real cost, right? Like the person who owns that home and wants to retire and move closer to their grandkids, or wants to move to another part of the county or something, they're the ones paying that cost, right? In terms of their lost property value, the money they don't get. No attempt to quantify that, no attempt to make residents whole, right? Obviously, the deal starts to fall apart. The whole plan for the facility probably starts to fall apart if we had, magically waved a wand and said, okay, Shell, you can build the ethane cracker facility, but you have to compensate every resident who lives within 5 miles by an amount equal to their declining home value. Shell would have said, oh, never mind, the costs outweigh the benefits, we're never going to build the thing, right? And so when you just don't include the costs, it's really easy to see the benefit if you're Shell, right? Other things, obviously, beyond just this economic value, we talk about environmental and healthcare damage. There's no bill going to Shell for environmental cleanup. Shell is not going to get the bill for folks who have 5, 10, 20, 30-year healthcare costs associated with this. The insurance companies aren't going to send Shell a bill for the difference between what they cover and what they don't. They're just going to raise people's premiums. And none of those dollars factor into this economic analysis, right? This is very hard to do. I'm not pretending that I'm also a genius who could sit here and actually do this, but I'm also not asking the state of Pennsylvania for several $billion in tax incentives, right? And so we kind of could argue there's a higher bar to clear if you're actually asking people for this taxpayer, essentially supported project. And then finally, there's kind of what we call some user error in the study, which is one, if you read their assumptions in the appendix of the 2014 study carefully, they actually say that their entire study is predicated on Shell creating the jobs that Shell told them it's going to create. I will tell you, you could not get published in economics by an academic peer-reviewed journal if I just started by saying my first assumption is that my policy will produce the result I say it will. That is not a really credible starting point to say, well, we just took what Shell told us at face value and we extrapolated from that. That's not an independent study at that point. And then second is they actually, authors use the incorrect industry codes for the facilities. The federal government tracks job data, and the software they used extrapolates job projections based off of the industry that those jobs are created in. Not all industries create the same number of jobs. Some of them have much larger supply chains, and so you make one job over here, you have a bunch of dominoes that fall, and you actually create more jobs down the line. They used an industry, they misclassified the plant essentially in their software, and they used an industry that has a much larger, much more robust supply chain. So the number of dominoes that fall looks a little bit bigger with the code they selected, which is not really what the plant is technically classified as. So you're going to hear a lot of discussion if you watched or went to the community meeting that Shell recently had. They actually used the word multiplier. Forgive my typo here in the title. But essentially, the bottom line is the type of model they've used essentially inflates the multipliers. When you don't include any of the real costs, you can basically just say everything is great. It's all gravy. We're going to build this thing, and every job we make is going to be a brand new job. We're going to put all these people to work. We're going to have all this positive impact on the community. And it's kind of an obvious when you sit and think about it that if you don't put very many of the costs in, you're going to get a positive number out on the other side of the model. And the way that works is through what we call the multiplier. So if I pay you your paycheck for working for me, let's say I'm Shell, I don't really want to be, but we'll pretend for a moment. If I'm Shell and I hire you and I give you a paycheck, you're going to probably re-spend anywhere from 70 to 90, and in some cases 100% of your paycheck on stuff you need to survive: rent or a mortgage payment, your car payment, gasoline, groceries, entertainment, Netflix subscription, you name it, right? And retail shopping. And those dollars are going to trickle back through and support the cashier at the grocery store, the person who stocks the shelves, the coder who works for Netflix. I don't know that my $14 a month is paying a huge portion of the coders, but it's a little bit. And so that's what we call the multiplier, is when you create one job, you actually create slightly more than one job when you follow that dollar through the supply chain and through what those employees end up spending their personal paycheck on. And so this model spits out a multiplier. I have seen some wacky multipliers across industry. We did a project with steel last year, and the steel industry says every steel job creates 11 more jobs in the economy. And I said, well, if that's true, then every town in America should be trying to build a steel mill, because that's incredible, right? That if I make one steel job, I get 10 new jobs out of it. Steel jobs do produce jobs, but probably not 10 to 1. And so this RMU study essentially gave Shell a really high multiplier. When it went in front of the state and it submitted its application for all these tax incentives, it looked really good. And they said, oh, we've got 450 jobs, but we're actually going to support thousands of jobs in the community. The problem is not all those jobs are from Beaver County, right? Some of those construction workers are out of county or out of state. And so the money starts kind of leaking out, and the model doesn't really hold up in real life. But you can see, hopefully, from my explanation, I know it had some jargon in it, but you can see hopefully why industry loves these models, these forecasting models, because you can make them say whatever you want to say, and you can just ignore, if you assume the right things, you can just ignore some of these costs. And most people don't dig too far into it. It was really hard for us to get the 2014 study. We actually had to track it down. It took us about 9 months to track it down. Coincidentally, RMU doesn't have it published on their website. Shell certainly didn't give it to us. The authors at one point in correspondence told us they couldn't give it to us because it was property of Shell, which is confusing for an independent academic study to be owned by a private corporation. But anyway, we managed to track it down, which was the key to the studies. We actually read their original study. They did put out a second study in 2021 where they don't explain how they got the numbers, but they say, oh yeah, we're using the same assumptions as our first study, and then their first study is not really publicly available, which again, it would be difficult for me to publish in a peer-reviewed credible journal and say, I'm citing my previous work, but don't worry, you can't get a copy of it. You can't see my previous work, but trust me, it's good. That would probably not fly for very many folks. So here's a visual, right? In a good economic model, which typically when I try to model things like this, it is a disadvantage in that we can't really predict, but we can always look backwards. We can look at what really happened. So when I study these types of projects around the country to look at tax incentives and job creation and compare them, I use empirical methods that try to, Cliff, I know economics isn't science, but we try our hardest to get as close to an experiment as we can. Now, I can't go out in the world and build a polluting factory and observe what happens. That's not very ethical. I mean, I guess Shell did it, but it's not very ethical for me to do it just for a study. So what I have to do is I have to basically go collect data on places where this really did happen, and enough of them to have a big enough sample size, right, across states and countries, and I have to control for those differences. And then I have to essentially look at a large enough time period before this plant got built and after the plant got built and what happened to the jobs. And then I have to actually try to run some sort of regression model that connects everything and controls for things and tries to eliminate things that could also be influencing my results, right? And that's in social science as close as we can really get to doing an experiment in the lab. So this is how I would want to approach it in theory, right? I would say, okay, here's my ethane cracker. Let's say that's green. We're going to make some jobs, maybe not 450, but maybe some jobs. But I need to compare it and add into that formula. I need to add the healthcare expenses. I need to add the higher wages and all the offsetting kind of non-investment that may discourage from other local companies. I need to add in the declining property values. I need to add in the cost to the state to monitor the pollution, to the legal fees to try to hold them accountable for the pollution, the cleanup costs, the land that's going to change in value. I need to add all of this in. And really what the RMU model looks at is just this. So you can, again, you can see how they get this really rosy answer when you just ignore all the stuff that should be added into the model and added into the equation. So when they come out and Shell says, oh yeah, it's just this big green up arrow for the county, I'm skeptical that that's true, right? And when you don't see the huge spike that stays there, right, for the long term in the federal data that the Department of Labor collects, you get even more skeptical and you say, well, you know, this giant green arrow didn't happen. Gee, maybe some of these red arrows actually outweighed the green arrow. And if that's the case, why are we paying you billions of dollars in effective value or foregone revenue? And so what I really want to stress is that the study essentially says, well, here's this big green up arrow from building the Shell plant. And if we don't build the Shell plant, nothing's going to come to that site. We're not going to have this big company in Beaver County, and we're not going to have all this economic activity. So man, oh man, we're between a rock and a hard place. We've got to either do nothing or we've got to build the Shell plant. And that's really a false choice, right? But we see it again across the country. It happens every day here in Ohio. All these state economic development folks, they love to frame the conversation as, gee whiz, we have to do this because if we don't, we're not going to get anything. And that's actually not the right comparison to make. Because the state is providing billions of incentives, presumably the state is willing to not collect that amount of revenue, right, from the economic activity. You start to wonder, well, what could you divert that revenue to instead? If you're going to lower property values with the plastics plant, you're going to collect lower property taxes on those lower property values. So your local schools, your local senior citizen services, mental health services, county health services are all going to lose money, lose revenue potentially. So if we're willing to lose that revenue for Shell, could we lose it and do something else with it instead that has a bigger bang than the dollar for the dollar than giving it to Shell? And so one thing I'll just note is that a lot of the peer review literature out there, Tim Bartik at Upjohn has been a real big leader in this. I have some colleagues I work with, Amanda Weinstein, who is at the University of Akron here in Ohio, have started thinking about this and saying, well, what types of things do better than these large corporate mega projects? And the answer is actually not that hard. It's not that surprising. One, small businesses. Small businesses carry a multiplier of about 5 empirically, which means we didn't forecast that with a bunch of assumptions. We actually looked at, okay, you create a small business, what happens in the real life data following the creation of the filing of a new small business with the state? And the data holds up over and over again, state after state, that local small businesses carry a multiplier of 4 or 5. Every local job you create creates more local jobs. That kind of makes sense. Local folks don't have their accountants and financial analysts and marketing people at a headquarters overseas or in Houston or somewhere else. They typically have a supply chain and a services chain that's local, right? They use a local, fairly local accountant, right? In Beaver, maybe they use some services out of Pittsburgh, but keeping dollars in that region is better than shipping them overseas or to Texas or Louisiana. And so local businesses tend to have these higher effect when you support a local business. So maybe we could divert some of these dollars away towards incubating entrepreneurship or establishing new pipelines for entrepreneurship at local community colleges or local universities or high schools, whatever, right? Startup funds. The other thing that typically we see is when you use supply chains that are already in the region and workers who already have expertise in certain industries, you get a bigger bang for your buck. It doesn't necessarily make sense to come plop down a brand new petrochemical plastics facility in a region that has not previously produced plastics, because you don't have that built up base, right? You see this all the time. People say, we're going to be the next Silicon Valley. We're going to, become the next tech hub. When I present this in Ohio, I use there's a photo of the Cleveland Browns quarterback, and he's got, they've got the jersey has like the 45 names of all the different guys who have played quarterback for the Cleveland Browns who were supposedly going to help them win, and they've never won. And they just keep crossing out names, right? And that's Silicon Valley, Silicon Heartland, Silicon London, Silicon New York City. We're going to get Amazon. We're going to get Google. You can't recreate Silicon Valley somewhere else. There's a bunch of factors that are unique to that spot, including the people who live there, right? Not every region of the country had Steve Jobs and Bill Gates tinkering in their garage. Not every university in the country had the resources Stanford had. There was a confluence of things that came together that made that spark. And you can't recreate it. It's like catching lightning in a bottle. And so investing in trying to catch lightning in a bottle in regions of the country that have previously no history or no skill set or no workers who have experience in these industries is not a recipe for success. It makes far more sense to invest and double down on things that we already know that Western Pennsylvania is good at. We know the types of industries that have been lost from the region. And so we should be focusing on either trying to pivot those. Green hydrogen and green steel making is one way we've talked about doing it as one component. But there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle that would be better investments than trying to grow a new industry out of the ground magically that has never been there before. And then finally, I know I'm at time, so I'll say, Amanda has talked a lot, and we are talking a lot about what we have kind of branded loosely as quality of life-based development. Whenever anybody asks me if a region is developing or if an economic development strategy works, or if a project we're giving a bunch of money to and we're helping start is going to make our region better, I always say, show me the school enrollment, because that is how you know whether a region is economically doing well. Is school enrollment going up or is school enrollment going down? Because it turns out across the country, the data pretty much bears out, people like to live where it's nice. And if people live there, they will start businesses there. They will spend money there. They will find jobs there. Things will happen when people want to be somewhere and raise families there and go to school there. And so that's really one of the key factors I think that we have to look at is quality of life. Is the community nice? Are the schools nice? Are the parks nice? Is the environment nice? Can I go hiking nearby? Is the waterway polluted? Is the downtown, nice? Is there, are the restaurants good? Is there a theater scene? Those are the types of investments you can make that really actually have an outsized impact. And so we're starting to think about how to research that more, how to look at data on that more, to think about this kind of alternative approach to economic development. Because I think, sadly, the Shell facility is really just the latest, and not even the latest, more have happened since, in a long line of kind of failed bets by state governments and local governments that, this is the company that's going to save us with their new facility, their new plant. And there are a lot of communities across the region here that are still waiting, unfortunately, to be saved, despite trying over and over again this same strategy. So I will leave with this quote, which I always kind of come back to, which is from an economist at a seminar I was at once who studies this, who said, governments don't usually know how to pick winners if they have to give away money to grow the economy with a private company, but losers always know how to pick their governments. They always know. The losers, the bad bets, always know how to lobby for the largest benefit to themselves. This Shell facility would not have happened without the state of Pennsylvania passing and giving it these incentives. And so our big takeaway is, unfortunately, they did. And we hope that our report about Pennsylvania's bad bet, kind of revaluing it after the fact, is a piece that will discourage other states from trying the same thing, or at least maybe ask some of the folks we put in charge of these decisions to ask harder questions. You cannot just get a study put in front of you that says everything's going to be better and slap down billions of dollars to that person, right? That is not a good business plan for the state. So I will stop there. I know I've been going for a little while, but if there are questions or comments, I welcome them and really appreciate the opportunity to join you all tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to all the great work that ORVI does. We will open it up to questions now. I saw some hand claps, so thank you for that. Does anyone have a question for Nick about this report? Okay, it looks like Mark Dixon has a question in the chat. Do you know what the data shows on school enrollment in Beaver? Nick, you're muted.
Sorry. I actually have not looked at that Beaver data in the most recent year, but there has not been a large spike. I will say, as much as I don't want to say I want to be fair to Shell, which is kind of a unfortunate thing to say out loud, you typically won't see that jump immediately, right? If the plant just started operation, they've just started supposedly with all these jobs. If I said, well, the school enrollment hasn't grown, you guys aren't developing the county, Shell would say, well, that's a lagging indicator. That's something that we would see show up 5 or 6 years from now when people come and start having kids, and then the kids have to become 6 to show up in kindergarten. So there had been no spike the last time I looked at the data, but I will admit that I have not looked at the end of year 23 data for Beaver.
Thank you. All right. I'm just reading a question from Terry. I think she's just pointing out from a previous report. And I want to highlight that Phoebe Reese said Pennsylvania has a 1-to-1 fossil fuel lobbyist ratio on the state level. And that's pretty scary.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who aren't elected, right? And one of the takeaways from this is politicians do love ribbon cutting, right? We call it ribbon cutting syndrome, where they love to show up, and it's usually someone else's problem when it goes wrong, right? I mean, so this is all of these tax incentives were under the legislators that were there in 2012. And the governor in 2012, right? And so they have no political consequence for any of the outcomes because they got to benefit from it all in 2012, right? From the rah of the beginning of the project.
Yeah, terrifying. We have a question from Joel Sidney. Can you provide any info on the existence of an environmental impact study that should have been required prior to the approval of the plant? I agree on that. But are you aware of any environmental impact studies that have happened?
I am not aware of any specific environmental impact study that has happened. I will say that I also agree it should have happened. I will also say that, and a lot of you folks are probably honestly more experienced than I am in some of these environmental specific fights. But, in my department here at Ohio State, we have quite a few folks whose specialty, whose careers are environmental economists. And we have one colleague who worked on the Exxon Valdez spill and the litigation that came from it. And one of the things that is very common in these types of pieces is because you can make these models say whatever you want, depending on what assumptions you make. Typically what happens is there's an environmental study and it comes back against Shell, right? The cost would be astronomical. The plant would never get built, and it would go, Shell would say, oh, this is crazy. We're not going to pay this much money to help mitigate environmental damage. Because that's kind of the theme, right? Is when you actually calculate the dollars involved in the environment, projects become prohibitively expensive like this for polluting projects. But Shell will just hire a team of economists who will use a different set of assumptions, and then they'll go to court, right? And then in court, both sets of economists will testify about all their modeling, and you get so lost in the jargon that what ends up happening is not really much, right? I mean, and that's kind of a negative view of it, but unfortunately, there are economists out there who are kind of willing to carry some of the water for the big companies on this. Because I will tell you, I think that expert witnesses on Shell's side of the debate probably collect a better paycheck than expert witnesses on the state of Pennsylvania's side. I don't know that for sure, but if I had to put money on it myself, that's what I would probably assume.
I would assume that with you.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, did you guys reach out to any of the authors on, for example, the RMU report, and did they stand by what they said back then?
They have not commented since the release of our report, which is also an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I won't put words in anybody's mouth, but typically, if you stand by, your analysis you did, you would defend it. It's unclear. I will say, and I really want to be careful not to speculate or slander anybody in particular, but I will say, I think we have unresolved questions about how this report kind of came to be. I think we have unresolved questions about, was this a project that was, RMU was contacted, the money was routed through RMU's research office, and then, budgeted almost like a grant would be through a university? Or was this a private consulting project that was done on behalf of Shell, where, the money was not routed through the university itself? This original study is not published anywhere on the university's page. The 2021 study is, but not the original 2014 study. And so there's a lot of factors here that just kind of, I think, are sort of eyebrow raising to me as from an ethical standpoint as a researcher. The authors are listed on the study. When we asked them originally for the 2014 study, the only communication that the member of our team who corresponded with them got back was that they could not share it with us because it was Shell's property, which I will tell you, with my own experience of working with grants funded studies, independent studies at Ohio State, if Ohio State's research office received the grant and then the university disperses it to me to do the work at my hourly rate, the grant owner does not own this. Like, the study is not something that is then privately sealed away in a vault somewhere, right, by the person who gave us the grant. It's put out and published in the public world on behalf of the university. So again, I don't want to make any claims that I know something. I don't want to speculate more than I probably already have, but I will say I think there are several pieces to the puzzle here around how this study came to be that, as a researcher, caused my eyebrow to go up a little bit at how we got from point A to point D. Which is the study came out, and legislators cited it in passing these tax incentives. I have some questions about what happened at B and C along the way. And unfortunately, the original authors have not commented since the release of our study.
Have you reached out to any of the legislators involved for a comment, or any current legislators who are dealing with this?
We have not. As far as I know, I have not personally reached out to any current legislators. I will say that we were able to procure the 2014 study from folks who were involved in media and government back in 2012 and 2014. So that was another piece that I did see an article run about this that said we hadn't reviewed the original 2014 study, but I do want to clarify, we did get a copy of the 2014 study, and it had been made public at some point to journalists and legislators back in 2014, and so we were able to find someone who still had a copy of it in their archives that was able to share.
Yeah, God bless that person.
Yes.
Terry had a question. Do you have any estimated projections for either the healthcare costs the plant will bring or the regulatory costs that will be involved?
So I do not. For the regulatory side, I think you all probably have a better idea of what the type of pollution is that has come from this thing and what that would look like to actually clean up than I do. Typically, what would happen here is the healthcare costs. You would try to hire somebody to estimate that, and you would want to estimate it as in a way that was as inclusive as you possibly could be, right? So one way would be to go look at data so far around emergency room visits who folks have cite having asthma or breathing problems or something, and sync those up to flares and try to correlate the data that way and try to estimate, okay, well, what does the data show about the increase in hospitalizations or the increase in ER visits or primary care visits who have symptoms related to some of this pollution? Obviously, that health data is really private and difficult to obtain, and not everyone wants to share their personal health data, understandably. So I think it would be hard to fully estimate the cost, which is, the companies know that, right? When they do these studies, that when you start trying to say, well, we want to try to estimate it out for 50 years of, someone who's 20 today in Beaver County who lives there for the next 50 years, are they going to have cancer when they're 70 from this thing going in? And we don't know, right? I mean, it's really hard to prove a causation. And so unfortunately, we've kind of adopted an innocent until proven guilty approach to that for these companies across not just Pennsylvania, but the country. I will say that the other interesting factor of the study is that they use a 40-year timeline. So they try to project the jobs out for 40 years. One of my co-authors is an expert based out of Houston who does tons of oil and gas and plastics work, a plastic chemical engineer. She was unable to find, through any kind of records requests across states, we cannot find another ethane cracker plant whose economic impact study extended beyond 15 years. So the job totals and the economic dollar total that they're estimating as a benefit to the county is based on that plant operating for 40 years, despite the fact that it's barely been able to operate for one very well. But if it operated for 40, very likely, and I know some of you are more expert on this than I am again, Shell would have to put more money into it before the end of 40 years. There is no way the plant as built today will last 40 years without additional dollar capital investment from Shell. And so to say that we're going to assume it's going to be there for 40 years when Shell will likely reevaluate that plant at some point in time and may actually say, the price of ethane has changed in the world market, other plants have come online, plastic demand is down as people become more concerned about the environment. Single-use plastics are no longer a hot commodity the way they were in 2012 when we thought about this, right? So for a variety of factors, Shell may say in 10 years or 15 years, never mind, we're not throwing good money after bad, we're not going to run the thing anymore. Well, suddenly you've justified the whole project based on predicting out jobs for 40 years. And somewhere in there, Shell's going to shut it down, right? Very likely. I mean, there's plants that have been run by Thai companies, none of the Gulf Coast ethane crackers, none of them used a 40-year timeline. They all used 15 years, which is kind of another fundamental flaw we felt to the study.
Yeah, that certainly seems like maybe inflating some information. It looks like we have another question in the chat. Is there anything we can do now to use this study against Shell?
Well, I think so. I don't want to give ourselves too much credit as an organization, but I do think that there has been some I'm not sure that, for a variety of reasons, that Shell's community meeting that it had was something that was not at least partially driven by the publicity around this study and several other pieces of information that have come out, as well as kind of preempting their earnings call from the other day, where they said, well, maybe this isn't as profitable as we hoped. And something certainly not going to be as profitable as you hoped when you admit that it cost double what you thought it was going to cost to build and operate. So it's hard to go back in time and unwind these incentives, right? You probably aren't going to get the state of Pennsylvania to go claw back. And that's kind of the hard part is, there's not really great provisions in law in any state to recollect this money without litigation. And obviously Shell is pretty experienced at litigation. And so you end up throwing good money after bad, trying to get your money back. What I would say is that I would ask folks in the state government when they approve these projects, and as more projects come up, and as local officials start thinking about, there's a cascade of effects, right? One thing I always tell people is what happens when local schools need more funds because we've diverted revenue collection from decreasing property values, right, near the plant. And so the schools need a levy. So they ask taxpayers to increase the millage. So suddenly we're all going to pay more for our property taxes because we need to fund our schools, but the schools need the money at least in part because we depressed all the property values with this plastics plant, right? When local folks get say in these things, right? County commissioners, township folks, state legislators from the region, they've got to get asked those questions, right? They've got to say, you know, how is that all baked in? How are you getting these numbers? And most of the time when we ask those questions, folks don't really know, right? They'll cite back to the RMU study. And so I think it's really, unfortunately, in this case, a cautionary tale, but it's something I think that can be pointed to and say, this was we did a bad analysis of this when we launched it. And now we have to admit that. And as we think about the future of the facility, we have to acknowledge that this is a sunk cost, right? I mean, Shell is going to eventually acknowledge that this thing is not as profitable as they hoped. The state is going to have to admit that they're not getting the ROI on the tax incentives that they wanted to get. So hopefully this will serve as a reference point, to kind of, you know, flag in the ground that folks can say, look, we need to ask harder questions, and the people we elect need to ask way harder questions before they give away this kind of money to corporations to come in and try to save the day with their investment.
Yeah, and I can speak for BC Mac. We definitely reference these ORVI reports.
Well, I'm glad that
Legislators.
every time we write one of these, I
We
will say
do.
I'm always like glad when I see people interested in them, because, you know, my wife is not a tax and economist, and so she's always like, what I try to talk about this at dinner, and she's like, it sounds really important and I do care, but man, it's tough to get people to talk about tax incentives and have fun doing it.
No, we just had a meeting with a PA representative this week where we were sure to reference an ORVI report, and we continue to do that. So thank
Yes,
you for
and
this
I
one,
do want
because I'm not a tax expert. So believe me,
to.
we need this type of data. It
Well,
helps.
I'm glad it's useful. I do want to address a question I saw here just real quick. One of the things that we are really pushing as a potential reform, I mean, not we as ORVI, but one of the things I have said and others have said, economists have said, is an important component is this local input element. I saw a question about were Beaver residents given a chance, and I'm not familiar with what happened in Beaver on the ground in 2012 and 2014 and trying to get resident input to make it, you know, smooth everything over to make this happen. But one of the things is that anytime that the tax power for local taxes is given away to the higher level of government, right? Anytime local property tax revenue is able to be exempted by the state government, you introduce this new element where the lobbyists can come into play, right? Where you can actually start to see interests diverge from what's best for people who live in the community to what's best for people in Harrisburg. And so what you start to really see is it becomes prudent for politicians to say, well, we want to be able to approve these tax incentives at the state level. So if there's a corrective policy for this, I think it does start with empowering local governments with more veto power over these types of deals that actually has teeth, that actually can say, you know what, we voted, because you can get to your town councilman or city councilman or county commissioners a little bit easier than you can get to your state legislator, and certainly easier than you can get to the governor, right? And so giving localities power back and kind of the final say on these, I know that's maybe sounds really naive, and people, you know, are like, well, yeah, I'm sure Shell really wants to give local communities more power over these things. But that is, if a politician asks me, what should we do? I'd say you should let people in their local communities decide if they want to give away a bunch of tax revenue to a company.
Amen, Nick. And as a Beaver County taxpayer, when we are faced with our, largest bump ever, I'm sure we would have had a lot to say about this. Before we let you go, we have one more question from Bob. He said the KOZ was extended from 12 years to 25 years. Was that data figured into the RMU report or your report?
So the Army, yes, we kind of look at the KOZ for 25 years, and that's another reason we kind of look at their 40-year timeline and think, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because in theory, these tax benefits are going to expire, right? So if I'm Shell and I have to update the actual literal hardware at the site to make it, safe and compliant and functioning, and I lose my tax benefits from the KOZ after 25 years, why on earth am I going to operate this thing for 40, right? Without the state coming back in 25 years and saying, well, actually, we're going to extend your benefit another, so the 40-year timeline really doesn't make sense. In terms of the KOZ period, the RMU study doesn't talk about it. That's another piece of why we kind of look at it and we're like, well, man, it's really hard to determine if this economic impact is going to outweigh the cost if you didn't think about the cost of the actual tax incentives, right? And Cliff, I know you had a point earlier about folks will say, well, this shouldn't have happened. If we didn't get the Shell plant, we'd be in worse case because we wouldn't have any industry, anything sitting there, right, at the old mining company site. And that's why you need that type of analysis, right? That's why you need Shell to actually say, here's our net value added. Because they need the burden should be on them to prove that getting this Shell plant is better than not getting it. And not only is better than not getting it, but is better than anything else you could do with the same amount of tax revenue, or 70% of the same tax revenue, or whatever that number is, right? And so that's really a core message of our report is this whole thing is really a false comparison, because it doesn't consider the alternative. If anybody's ever taken an economics course, I hope it didn't scar you for life, but we use the term opportunity cost, right? The true cost of something is the thing you give up to do it, right? And so what you've done when you've given a bunch of money to Shell, even if that money is just accounting money from tax revenue being shifted around, you've essentially not done that for something else, right? You've essentially not used that land, that potential tax revenue, those tax credit, your political capital to pass legislation. You've not used any of that for a different purpose or for a different project. And so what made this Shell project so compellingly and economically worthwhile that we believed in 2012 and 2014 that it would exceed the value of anything else we could do with those resources? And I think that's where the RMU study starts to kind of fall apart, as you say, well, they didn't really think about the opportunity cost. They didn't even think about the Keystone program and what you could have done instead. I mean, maybe you could have lured a different company that doesn't pollute the air and have to flare its, and light up the atmosphere, right? So I don't know. I mean, you could have mitigated the environmental costs even if you used the same tax incentives that Pennsylvania already put in place, and you just got something that wasn't a giant plastics facility. Maybe you built something that used workers who already had skills in different industries that lived there already, instead of having to go get a bunch of plastics engineers and chemical engineers who probably didn't live in the region when this thing started, because there was no prior history of the industry in the region, right? So, like I said, it's hard to grow something out of the ground when you have no history of growing that thing before, right? Farmers don't typically shift to a totally new crop in the middle of their career. And so I think there's value in making that point too, that the RMU study really didn't think about the cost in that way.
Yeah, thank
I've
you, Nick.
taken so
And
much time. I apologize. I am a
no,
talker,
I
and
have
I could
one
talk
more
about this stuff for
question,
days.
if that's okay. We have one more in the chat. I want to make sure we
Yes,
get
go
to it.
for
It's
it.
from Aaron. Are there agreements anywhere in the country that give state governments the power to require repayment of tax incentives if promises estimated via studies like these do not come into fruition?
So that's an excellent question. Not at the scale that we're talking about for the Keystone program and the feedstock tax credit, which again, I want to highlight. The feedstock tax credit literally gave Shell a tax credit for the inputs to its production process, which is kind of, if you have any background in business, kind of a kind of wild concept that the state is going to subsidize my input. No wonder I want to do the deal, right? If I'm going to be able to buy my raw materials and get a tax credit on the back end, of course I'm going to put this thing in Pennsylvania, not West Virginia or Ohio, right? So there were two types of the tax credit, the Keystone and then the feedstock on the actual ethane, which essentially, if Shell can buy its raw material cheaper than its competitors, right, then that's a huge financial business advantage for Shell, and makes Pennsylvania look really attractive to build the thing in the first place. But there are some smaller examples. Ohio, I don't love to give Ohio, even though I'm a lifelong Ohioan, I don't love to give our economic development folks in Ohio a ton of credit for certain things, but I will give them credit in that they have some decent practices in place to claw back or put money in escrow, where essentially if a deal falls apart or if a project never breaks ground, they get the money back, right? Ohio has some programs where they'll actually help rehab a site. So they'll go into a brownfield site, or they'll go into an old, industrial site, and they'll essentially front the capital to fix it up for the new tenant company to come in and create the jobs. But if that doesn't work out, then they get the money that, they get repaid their investment in fixing the thing up, or they reclaim the actual site. So this happened, if you're familiar with Peloton bikes, Ohio had a deal for one of the Peloton bike facility expansions during the pandemic. Well, the pandemic sort of ended and people stopped using the Peloton bikes. And so Peloton said, actually, we don't need to make so many bikes anymore. We're never going to do this. And Ohio was able to take control of that warehouse industry facility that they had actually put money into, and now they have that asset, right? So there's different ways to think about it. One of the things I will leave with on a parting note is we are doing a lot of work right now on the Hydrogen Hub announcement and the Hydrogen Hub project, which nobody, I think, really fully understands. I certainly don't understand who's buying all the hydrogen that we're going to make, but whatever, we're going to make a bunch of hydrogen anyway, and we're going to give a bunch of subsidies away for it. And there is a thing drifting around out there that everybody asks me about when I present on the hydrogen stuff, where they say, well, what about the community benefits agreement, the CBAs? And that is essentially a document and an agreement that the federal government is now requiring for someone to do this type of project through the IRA and all of the infrastructure legislation, where, we've consulted with the community and they've gotten their input, and we've made all these jobs promises and things, and we have this document, this community benefits agreement. Those are largely, in my opinion, toothless. They don't really have any legal clawback. There's no auto triggering clawback mechanism where, after 5 years, if you don't produce X in the real data, you lose, the money gets sucked out of your account back to the taxpayers. So I will just say that's a really great question. There are some small examples of economic development that has been able to either retain control of the actual assets or, claw back some of the investment. But if anyone here is involved in some of the hydrogen stuff over the next, coming years and months, and you're involved in those community benefit processes, just make sure to ask those types of questions there too, because the danger is that the community benefit agreement becomes essentially this thing that gets waved around later that says, well, the community completely agreed that they wanted this thing, right? And there's no real recourse from it. So I think that's another lesson from this for the region is as new stuff comes up and people say, oh, we want to sign this new community benefits plan with the local residents. Is it enforceable? Can you get your money back? And, if I gave you a receipt for something and the bottom of the receipt says, yeah, but you can't use it to return the item, it's not really a receipt, right? Like that's not really anything valuable to me as a customer. So I think those are lessons from this as well that hopefully folks will be able to apply.
Yes, thank you, Nick. And we certainly have quite a few things on the horizon, like hydrogen or, advanced recycling. So these are lessons that we can use and hopefully learn from. So
Yes.
thank you, Nick, for being here today.
Yep.
If you are open to people reaching out to you, feel free to drop your information in the chat. And we certainly welcome you to listen to our next part of the program, which will be Dr. Lau's update on what Shell has been up to recently.
Perfect. Thank you all. I will stop my screen sharing.
Thank you, Nick. And Dr. Lau, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi there. Good evening. It was a very good talk there. But I wanted to answer one of the questions of Joel's about the environmental study. Environmental studies by the federal government only needs to be done if federal money is actually being used to construct the thing. Money was given away here, but it wasn't given for the construction. So there wasn't any kind of, and there was a little bit of an environmental study done. The shoreline of the Ohio River had to be changed in order for Shell to get some of their barges in during construction. And the Army Corps of Engineers did do a environmental study there to see what they were going to do to alter the shoreline, whether or not that would have any environmental effect. And they came back that it didn't, so they went ahead and did it. The other example of a environmental is that part of getting your air permit, your water permit, and all that, Shell and also with the DEP did a study of what the emissions are, which we will talk about here, and making sure that they didn't cause an undue impact on the health. And now again, that's all calculations, all based on factors that they put in for the different materials and stuff. But supposedly, if Shell stays within their emission levels, then they should not have a exceedingly high impact, but there will be some impact. So hopefully that answers your question, Joel. So Nick showed you all the stuff that Shell didn't give you. I'm going to show you what Shell has given you as a real quick summary of 2023. As you probably know, they gave their emission numbers, and I've been going through the numbers similar to the financial numbers that Nick goes through. But Shell wasn't really fully operating most of the year. They've had a lot of hiccups. So this 12-month review of 2023 probably isn't really representative of what the plant would be once it's really up and running. In fact, Shell just made the announcement that they filled the 1,000th truck with pellets. And if you know the volume of those trucks, and Shell says that when they're fully up and running, they should be able to make 1.6 million pounds of polyethylene. Well, 1,000 trucks is only 1.5% of that. So far, in all the time they've operated, I'm waiting for them to come up and tell us when they filled up the 1,000th rail car. We have seen movement on the rail cars, but they haven't told us how many they've filled up. So we're not sure what that is currently. So we'll start off with the numbers. If you want to go to the next slide, Hillary. So as I said, this is from the emission numbers for Shell. As you know, the pollution limits are set on what's called a sum of a 12-month period. So you have 12 months added together. When you have another month, you drop the last month, the old month, and add the new one in. So it's a moving 12-month average. And so it's nice to look at 2023 because we have 12 months. So in the total of 2023, from January all the way to December, the amount of carbon monoxide they gave off is 970 tons, and they're limited to 984. So again, they're walking pretty close to the line. Ammonia, they've given off 42 tons. They've got a limit of 154, so they're doing pretty good there. NOx, they're not doing. They've given off 334 tons, and their limit to right now, they're exceeding their value for what they're allowed to give off as far as NOx. And that's part of the problems we're seeing, I believe, with the orange sky and stuff is coming from that. PM 2.5 particles, they've given off a total of 77 tons in 12 months. They got a limit of 164 tons. Now, the one I'm interested in being organic is the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds. Right now, the 12 months, they've 390 tons. They have a limit of 516. So they've actually fallen under. They're now in compliance. But that's sort of because in November, we had indications they were down for maintenance and stuff. And in November, they only actually gave off 5.5 tons of that. So when you add that in to your total, that really helps out. They've been averaging about 34 tons a month. And that's how if you take 516 and divide it up by 12, you get pretty close to that number. So as long as they stay at a monthly average of about that, they should, but they only became under at 516 at the end of 2023 up until September of 2023. In September, they were at 512. So that's when they finally, in a way, broke even. And I'm sure then November helped them out a lot by only putting 5.5 tons in. So that's what brings them to their current 12-month sum of 390. The other one of concern is HAPs, hazardous air pollutants. Again, they're exceeding it just on the line. So if they have any hiccups or anything, they're going to have troubles with that. Right now, they 12-month of 33, and they have a limit of 32. But one of I think is interesting, and I have to is methane. There is no limit for methane, but as you guys probably all know, it's a very strong greenhouse gas. And to me, they've given off quite a bit of that, of 887 tons. And I need to go back and look at the numbers and find out which one, and we'll talk about, we'll show you the examples here in a bit that we can look at and see where each specific material comes from and what's responsible for it. So next slide. So with the hazardous air pollutants, this is the way that they break down. A lot of it comes from the cracking furnaces, 18 tons per year. The process unit is the area in between the cracker unit and the polymerization unit. The flares and incinerators, everybody's familiar with those. The tank and load out, the train rail. This is from that area. The fugitives, that's basically leaks. So all over the plant, wherever they have a valve or pipe leaking, that's 5.4 tons. The waste treatment plant is 0.4 tons. And an interesting thing is that the cooling towers, and everybody's been saying all the steam and stuff that they see coming off the cooling tower. Well, it is steam. It's not a combustion site, so it's not smoke. But in that steam, there is both HAPs, and the main one is hexane, and the other thing is 2.5 micron particles. So even though it's steam, the more steam you see putting out, the more of the HAPs and the VOCs and the particles are in that steam. So it's not like what Shell says is just like steam coming off your teapot on your stove. It's not quite that that simple. So next slide. So we can actually look at specific HAPs. They tell what the speciation is. And one of great concern is that 1,3-butadiene. I did this analysis earlier in the year, and I was quite amazed that that's the biggest one, and it's still the biggest one. And 95% of that comes from the soup cans, the totally enclosed ground flares, and the E-flare. Then the next one is benzene. They've given off 16 or almost 17,000 pounds of that, and that 70% of that comes from the soup cans and the E-flare. And then the rest of them, we have toluene, formaldehyde, xylene, ethylbenzene, acetaldehyde, and hexane. And the biggest percentage of that, you can see the toluene is kind of dispersed throughout the plant, but the largest one single source is the combustion turbines. And all these combustion turbines, that's all the three, the little sisters, or we call them, or the cogen units. So all this is the major producers of these other HAPs are coming to various degrees from the operation of the cogen unit, besides other operations within the plant. So next slide. So one of the questions has been what's actually on the site, and I think we're going to have our next month's meeting is going to be about rail, and we just had the anniversary of the train derailment in East Palestine. The kind of chemicals that were on that train aren't ones that the Shell plant has, but they do have a lot of other things that are potentially hazardous and stuff. So this is a list of the different storage tanks and vessels. Some of this is stored and burned off. Other of it is put into the rail cars that they have and used at other facilities. So they have C3, mainly propane and higher hydrocarbons. They have butene, isopentane, isobutane, the refrigerant for the C3s to keep them cold. An interesting one is they have storage of pyrolysis tar, and that comes again when you heat up the ethane in the ethylene cracker units up to 1500 degrees F, or use Celsius, 800 degrees Celsius. That just beats the heck out of the hydrocarbon and it degrades. And that's where this tar, so you can see that it's a mishmash of greater than 85% heavy oils, C9. So we've got quite a conglomeration. We've got, C2 going in, but yet the compounds can generate a C9, meaning it contains 9 carbons, water, trace of benzene, toluene, and even styrene, even though it's less than 0.1%. But if you've got 130 cubic meters of it, that still adds up. Next slide. So continuing with what they also come from the cracker units is what they call light gasoline. And that's not quite as thick and gooey as the pyrolysis tar. But again, it's a combination of the benzene, toluene, xylene, which we've had, the ethyl benzene, and styrene. You can see that a lot higher concentration of the lighter materials. And again, remaining is a combination of C2s all the way up to C5 hydrocarbons. Hexene is actually what they use as a co-monomer. They are making linear low density polyethylene. So besides using the ethylene, they also copolymerize that with hexene, and that's obviously coming in by rail car. And so that's another compound that could have a concern. And another one that they have in a limited amount of money, limited amount of is dimethyl disulfide. It has a real heavy sulfur. It's for the desulfurization to activate the catalyst in the cracking unit. So another interesting compound that they have stored on site, and also that comes in into the plant. So that could be a question. So this is what's there at the plant and what they've given off. They seem to be operating at a little bit more steady rate. We've noticed that they've had the maximum, they have 7 cracker units, and the maximum number of ones they can run at any one time is 6, because there's always one cracker furnace that's down for cleaning up to get all that pyrolysis tar and coke and everything out of it. And you've observed that possibly at night and stuff that they seem to operate a lot and put off a lot of steam. Again, if there's a lot of steam coming out, that means they're operating at a high efficiency or making, and that also means that they're giving off a lot of other stuff. We've been asking the DEP to do nighttime inspections. They just dumped a whole bunch of inspection reports. We've been looking through it, but they did an inspection at night from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. However, the night that they did that, their own report says that the cracker units and the production units were offline. So we need to get with the DEP and have them actually observe the place when it's up and full and running, and all the orange and everything that we see. So we'll see now as the numbers go into 2024, if they run at a more continuous basis, we'll get a better idea of what the amount of materials that they'll be giving off. The CAMs, the continuous air monitoring, lately has been pretty reasonable. They haven't triggered any of the 4 CAM units, so they seem to be controlling that. So it'll be interesting to see what the emission numbers are actually for the first 2 months of 2024, to see if that matches up with the CAM's observation. So last slide, any questions? Anybody have any personal observations or seeing things happening that they want to let us know about?
It looks like Nora has her hand up. Nora, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Cliff, for all these comments, and also to Phoebe for posting all that information about health effects of different chemicals. I was noticing that your chart, Cliff, which told what pollutants were coming out of the cogen plant. I thought it was very interesting. The cogen plant, I think, is where they produce electricity and distribute at least some of that to the community. Is that correct?
Yes.
Right. So,
and they also use it for generating the steam and the electricity that they use within the plant itself.
All right, and I'm curious about how all those pollutant levels compare with, say, a coal-fired power plant, or a natural gas, or windmills or solar. I would I think that would be an interesting comparison to see, like, if people are getting their electricity from there, how that compares. Thanks.
Yeah, well, if they were getting electricity from solar or wind, it would have none of those emissions. So that's a big difference there. And I haven't done just to look at what a coal-fired power plant would give off, but it would probably not give off quite the same of the low VOC materials, but would definitely give off more PM particles and some of the higher volatile compounds and stuff like that, and a lot more mercury and metals and stuff that the gas fired. They actually use some of the hydrogen and methane from the cracker unit to power that. They call it tail gas, which is a combination of some of the gas that comes off the cracker units. It's a combination of methane and hydrogen that comes off, and other things. So that could contribute to part of the pollution.
Thank you, Cliff. All right, it looks like Bob had his hand up. Bob, do you still have a question?
Yes, I do. One of the things that's still troubling about this plant being built in this area is when before Shell started building the plant, they had a town hall meeting at the golf course in Aliquippa. And at that time, I got to meet up with the two engineers that was going to run the plant. And I asked them, tell me a little bit about this. And they said, it's a state of the art. We have one just like it down in the Gulf. And I said, well, is it real flat down there on the Gulf? He said, oh yeah, flat as a pancake. I said, is there a lot of wind? They said, yeah, the wind blows everything out into the Gulf. And I said, did you ever hear of Denora, Pennsylvania? They both looked at each other and said, no. And I said, well, you need to. If you're going to build a plant in these river valleys, you have to take into consideration air inversions to where it traps in all of the gases coming out of the plant. And the one engineer turned around and walked away, and the other one put his hand on his chest, said, can I sit down? I have high blood pressure. And I'm like, that should have been a signal to me right there that they knew that they could not vent out all of these gases that we just talked about here, that were trapped inside these river valleys, and it's going to have a health effect. And you know, we're looking at ground flaring. We're looking at the other stacks that definitely don't take the exhaust out of this plant up over the mountain and disperse it. So I think we got bigger troubles than what a lot of people imagine, strictly because of the dispersion of all these deadly gases, and it scares me. That was something. I live in this valley. I'm very concerned, and I don't know what we're going to do about it.
Yeah, Bob, that's another thing I'm working on. You know, we have seen a lot of steam coming out of the cooling units and the cracker and others various parts of the plant. And it appears that they're putting out so much steam that it's actually the plant is creating its own weather system. We've seen some, and I've been working on trying to figure out the temperatures and relative humidity and wind and stuff that will create the different effects that we see going on there, and mainly the fact that it's trapping a lot of the pollution laying in the valley, and it's not being dispersed, which is part of their assumption when they did the modeling, that the material would be well dispersed over the area. Has anybody seen anything or have any reports to make about smelled anything, seen anything?
Speaking of reports, I just put some information on the chat. But please remember, you're always welcome to submit your Eyes on Shell report via DM, email, or phone call. I place that information in the chat along with information on how to contact Beaver County Emergency Management and also the DEP Southwest Regional Office. You know, we are always on call. Dr. Lau is always answering the phone calls that happen, and I'm the person typically responding via social media. So we are always looking out for what's going on and, you know, always open to any suggestions or comments you might have. So thank you guys again for being here with us today. As always, it's an absolute pleasure. Dr. Lau hinted at it, but next month we will be talking about the way that the rail system connects us and kind of opens us up to more, unfortunately, more possible disasters. So we'll be talking about how that might affect Beaver County specifically and how it affects people all over the United States. As always, it's the best